Well, hello, and welcome to Bio 211, Lab number 7, where we're looking at bone and cartilage. And in your lab handout, I'm looking at pages 9 through 13, at the very least, till we actually get to the different types of joints. And what I'd like to do for the next series of presentations for you is give you the introduction to materials that we're going to see inside lab. And the goal is that you're going to look at this material, prepare, so when we actually get into lab, you're aware of what we're going to accomplish. So the first thing I'd like to do is remind you actually have a skeletal system, and the skeletal system comes in two pieces. The one we're going to focus on today is going to be the axial skeletal system. And before we actually get to the axial skeleton, I'd like to remind you that throughout the skeletal system of which the skeletal system is part of the connective tissue system, connective tissues themselves, there are 3 different types of cartilage. If you go all the way back to chapter 4 inside your text, right? We have elastic cartilage, we have fibrocartilage, and we have hyaline cartilage. I'm just going to put an E for elastic. I'm going to put a F for fibro. This is going to be really important when we actually get to different ways the bones actually articulate. And remember, the most prominent way that bones articulate is at the epiphyses of their ends. And if you don't know that yet, essentially, here's a bone, right? Here's a bone, and I'm going to just tell you it's the humerus just because it's going to look generally like a humerus, but not really much like one. And what I want you to see is if I change colors here, in bone, you're going to learn inside class that as bone develops, we actually have articulating ends regardless of the type of bone. There's going to be some form of articulation that's going to create some sort of a joint, and the joint may be movable or immovable or freely movable. What we're looking at here is freely movable joint, and at the epiphyses, this is proximal over here, meaning closest to the site of origin in the body. Okay, and this is distal, further away from the site of origin. This blue area here that I'm coloring in for you, that's all hyaline cartilage. Okay? Fantastic. Now, having told you that, let's get rid of this cartoon. Wham. Let's get rid of that. Cool. We're going to move on. What I want you to see next is that there are different types of bones. And there will be bone markings that's going to allow for the bone to actually have multiple functions. The sort of the Jack Skellington or Halloween type skeletal systems can only function in how they articulate and how connective tissues hold on to them. And the easiest way to teach you about these things is to give you the basic definitions of them. And you can actually see these inside your notes on page 9, where we're looking at the bone markings. We're going to cover them in a little bit of detail in a few minutes, but you're going to see inside your notes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 bone markings that you're going to have to pay attention to. At least I'm hoping you're going to pay attention to. How does that say? 9 major ones. 9 major markings. Okay, and we're going to use the skull to teach many of these things. And then as we move through the axial skeleton, you'll see we move from the skull to the hyoid bone, the only free-floating bone. Free-floating. Oops, floating. Let's see if we can spell. Free-floating bone. 1-O-N-E. Okay, and once we actually look at what it's doing, it allows us to actually create a vocal box and create space so we can breathe. We'll take a look at the bones that actually make up the vertebral column, okay, as well as the hips in the appendicular skeleton, okay, but they articulate, meaning the vertebral column articulates with the hips. We'll also articulate with the thorax, meaning the bones of the rib cage, as well as the manubrium, sternum, and xiphoid process. So we're going to try and get through this, so when you see all these things inside lab, it's pretty straightforward. By the time you've finished your packet, you should have finished it before lab starts, all of these things will be pretty straightforward. So a moment ago I told you that we have the axial skeleton. That's what we're going to spend today looking at. And I want you to see that there are 206 named bones that you'll know in the span of a few short days. And of those 206, really, you want to know the major bones of the axial and appendicular skeleton. We don't expect you to learn all of the digits and all of that sort of stuff. We do want you to pay attention to the bones that lie around the longitudinal axis for the axial skeleton. Whoops, what happened there? Control Z, let's go like this. Control B, there we go. Okay, as well as the skull bone, which actually has within it ear bones, right? You've already looked at those. Okay. And, oh, so what did I just do there? Control Z, let's go. Control Z, and I just did it again. Okay, so then I want you to the hyoid bone, we just spoke about a moment ago, the ribs, the sternum, the breastbone, as well as bones of the vertebral column. And then in the next presentation, we'll talk about the appendicular skeleton. Let's take a look at how your textbook represents it to you. And I really think this is useful in the sense that I don't want you memorizing how many each of these are there. That's useless information. Take a look at what they've done. Ball on stick with lines. Okay, and then you have appendages. That's why it's called appendicular skeleton. You actually have a series of bones that will attach to ball on stick with bones. Okay? Or lines, if you will. Now, ball and stick before was the central nervous system. These are the connective tissue structures, solid calcium phosphate deposits that are surrounding ball on stick. Okay? So that's what you're actually looking at here. If you're going to memorize any numbers of things here, it's going to be, well, what makes up the vertebral column? Well, there are 26 bones that make up the vertebral column. That's it. Okay, I don't want you memorizing the numbers of ribs or how many sternum pieces there are. That's not useful information. What is interesting to see here is how you break up how you think about it. Ball and stick with lines. Axial. Appendicular is those structures that attach to ball and stick. Okay. So here you actually can see it a little bit more broken up or divisioned. Okay, we're going to be focusing today on the blue parts. You're going to see how that happens in a few minutes. But more importantly, take a look at all the different shapes here. Because of all the different shapes, bones can be classified into 5 basic types based on shape. You can have a long bone. You can see where all the long bones are. You can have short bones. 2 really good examples here are trapezoid with wrist bones. Okay. You actually have flat bones, say the sternum, or irregular bones, like the vertebra. Okay, or sesamoidal bones. Sesamoidal bones are special. They actually form inside connective tissues, and they actually create points of leverage. You'll see I have that written out for you here. What I want you to pay attention to is, for lab, imagine on a practical, I'm going to point to a bone and go, oh, what type of bone is this? If it's long, it's a long bone. If it's short, it's a short bone. Don't make it more difficult than it actually is. If you turn back on page 9, I mentioned a moment ago, I want you to take a look at some of the bone markings you can actually find. Okay, and on this table from your textbook, I believe it's 7.2, what you can see here is that you actually have a series. Now, the list isn't the same as it is inside your notes for your lab. And if I'm you, I'm going to find what's inside my notes from my lab, and I'm going to study what's here. Because this is a much more complete description and definition. Definitely for what you would know for your class exam would be these definitions here, or descriptions here. But we want to think about what a condyle is, right? So let's go like this. Inside your lab packet, condyle is number 1. So let's go like that. Condyle is a large round protuberance. Big fancy word for saying something that sticks off of something else at the end of a bone. Epicondyle, okay, which would be down here, a process that forms the attachment point. An epicondyle is a projection above a condyle. So here's a condyle, which means above the condyle is where you're going to find this epicondyle. Facet, which we're going to see these smooth, flat, articular surfaces. We'll see a lot of these when we're thinking about vertebral bones. There's facet, there's epicondyle there. Foramen means hole. Okay, foramen means hole. Okay, opening through which blood vessels, nerves, and or ligaments pass. Blood vessels and nerves, as well as lymphatic structures, are going to pass through here. Okay. Underneath the foramen is going to be the fossa, and the fossa is a shallow depression. Okay, and that shallow depression allows for the accommodation of more space that's required. Inside the skull, you'll see many of these. You'll have the head of something that actually is a rounded articular projection supported on the neck or constricted portion of a bone. Okay. Meatus is a passageway. Where are you? I just saw you a moment ago. Meatus is a tube-like opening. It doesn't necessarily mean you can see all the way through it, but if you think about, like, say, the ear canal, that is a meatus. Okay, the external auditory meatus of the temporal bone. That's where sound travels in and it hits that tympanic membrane. The neck, we just described to you a moment ago. You're going to notice it's actually not on your list here. And I don't know why it's not there, just that the neck is a constricted portion of bone. So some bones will all have necks. And if you think about my earlier construction of the humerus, the thinner part would be the neck that attaches to the head. And then finally we have the trochanter, the one that seems to create trouble for students. A trochanter is a very large projection. Well, that doesn't mean anything until we actually take a look at, say, something on a really large bone, the femur. It's a bone inside your leg. You'll have the greater trochanter of the femur. And you'll see, I'm going to try and find examples of all of these as we're going along. Okay, fantastic. So let's get rid of that. Let's go here. We're going to change our attention now to the skull. Now, I'm doing this because it's the next lab. So that literally, that first piece right there was the end of our first lab. Can you find these bone markings on a bone? Now what I want to do is look at, use the skull itself to learn the bones that are on your list of structures to know. Okay. You're going to see these are on page 9 and 10. And then we'll pause there, and then we'll pick up again inside the vertebra. Okay, so let's go down. Here's the skull. And you already know most of these bones. You know these bones because you know the parts of the brain. Well, the frontal cortex also is covered by a frontal bone. The parietal cortex is covered by a parietal bone. Some of these bones you haven't seen before. We'll get into what they are. Okay, but some of them you actually are very much familiar with. You can see when I look at the side, here's the temporal bone. Okay, you're going to see that when we're looking at the back here, here's the occipital bone. And each of these are held together by sutures. Well, these are literally where the bones come together and they interdigitate and they hold on to one another. The ones you're probably less familiar with are those that actually make up the face. Skull is easy. Face is just a little bit more difficult. But let's start with something that is easy. And that's a mandible. That is your lower jaw. It articulates here with both the temporal bone. Okay, and when your mouth is closed, it may come up alongside the temporal process as well as the the zygomatic bone here. Okay. Let's take a look, a bit closer bit of look. What we've done is we've taken a sagittal plane here. Take a look, sagittal plane. And what we're doing is here is the actual breakdown. Blue is the frontal bone. Sort of red is the parietal bone. Sort of yellowish back here is the occipital bone. Notice how much protection you have in the back of your skull. It's to protect you from actually the trauma of hitting your head on something. Remember a moment ago I told you about that auditory meatus. Well, here's an inner auditory meatus, which means on the other side here you'd find the ear. Inside the skull, this is where you're going to find that sphenoid bone. This is where you're going to find that vomer. This will be where you find the actual maxilla. Okay? And the palatine bone is behind the maxilla. And there's that mandible. Okay. Notice all I'm trying to do is point out the bones that are on your list. So much like I've been trying to teach you all semester long, what I've done is I've said, look, go through your list, find the ones you know you're going to be able to identify from our list, and you should be able to draw this. And notice there's not a whole lot of complexity. Blue, red, yellow, purple will be the temporal bone, and then we fill it in with some of these ones you've never probably thought of before. This is the posterior view. So there's that occipital bone. Notice I'm pointing out in this one, sutures. You have a sagittal suture. Okay, actually mid-sagittal plane, right? Sagittal suture. Right? And then you actually have the sutural bone in some skulls. But back here, you can see that you actually have the lambdoid suture here. Okay. And here are some of the bones we were just looking at inside the skull, now that you've actually opened up the skull from behind. One more interesting view here. We're looking actually from underneath the skull. There's the maxilla, and here's the sphenoid bone, here's the palatine bone, and here's that occipital bone. And take a look at this thing. This is a foramen magnum, and that means this is where the spinal cord is actually passing through. Okay? And if you had more time, and we invested the time in actually thinking about this, you can actually see here, that's where the carotid is actually passing up into the skull. A more interesting thing to pay attention to is if here's the maxilla in yellow, here's the zygomatic bone that makes up your eye socket on the outside portion, and there's that temporal portion. So that means you've created an arch here, and this is what gives you your cheekbone structure. Here is the mandible itself. The mandible has a condylar process. It's a jaw that actually sits inside of a depression. So this is a condyloid depression. That means it's going to be sitting inside of a fossa. Okay. One thing, as you're finishing up the bones of the skull, you're going to see that we actually take a look at some of the sinuses. So on page 10, about the first third of the page down, it goes sutures. We just went through those. The paranasal sinuses. Here are your paranasal sinuses. Okay. And once we actually understand that these are spaces that occupy less pressure, it means mucus is made inside these spaces. Okay. And it drains down into your nasal cavity. Notice when you have a cold, that is when everything drains down or gets clogged up and it hurts. Before we finish off this section and move over to auditory ossicles, a hyoid bone itself, I want to introduce what happens when the fetal skull is developing. The fetal skull is going to develop, okay, imagine if I go like this, fetal skull is going to develop in what we're going to call ossification centers, right? You're going to have an ossification center there, an ossification there. And what happens is they literally grow out from here. The bone grows out as a plate. And as they grow together, they're going to replace this cartilage, which now we're going to call a suture, so that when they actually come together, they literally interdigitate. It's sort of just like this. So that would be the anterior fontanelle. And at birth, if you've ever touched a baby's skull, you know it's really soft on top. Okay? Posterior fontanelle here. Future squamous suture here. And this is the posterior lateral fontanelle. And this what this really means is you want to understand the idea that these bones are growing towards one another and they're moving away from soft tissue into hard calcified tissue. And that's a pretty good place for us to stop here. Okay? So far what I've done is I've introduced the basic bones of the skull. I've introduced the basic structures of bones, the types of bones, and some of the processes. Okay. Now take a look at this thing again. Maybe compare it to the notes you have from lab, and I'll see you guys in class. Have a great day.